Picture the ocean 16 million years ago. Not the ocean from postcards and diving documentaries, but something colder, wider, and considerably wilder, stretched across a planet whose continents hadn't even settled into the shapes we'd recognize on a modern map. Moving through that water, through currents cold enough to slow the heart of almost any other hunter alive, was something 80 feet long, weighing as much as 10 adult elephants, with teeth the size of a grown man's hand, curved, serrated, and built for exactly one purpose. It didn't drift. It moved with intention, cutting through temperatures that should have shut down an animal its size entirely. And for roughly 20 million years, across every ocean on Earth, nothing questioned its authority. Then, somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million years ago, it simply vanished, leaving behind almost nothing but teeth, a handful of shattered vertebrae, and nearly 2 centuries of confident scientific assumptions that turned out to be almost entirely wrong. For more than 180 years, we thought we understood exactly what this animal was. It ended up in museums, textbooks, and blockbuster films, lodged permanently in the imagination of every kid who ever felt a flicker of fear at the deep end of a swimming pool. Then a wave of modern instruments, machines capable of reading the chemistry frozen inside a single fossil, machines capable of tracing the branching family tree of living animals back tens of millions of years, finally turned their full attention toward whatever little this creature had left behind. What they found didn't just adjust the old picture. It erased it and started over from scratch. The version of this animal printed in every encyclopedia essentially never existed. And the real creature hidden inside the evidence the whole time turned out to be stranger, more biologically sophisticated, and ultimately far more tragic than anyone had ever dared to guess. Its scientific name is Otodus megalodon, and to understand why its story has captivated researchers for 2 centuries, you first have to understand just how completely it ruled the world it lived in. This wasn't simply a big shark. Big is a word we reserve for animals we can still reasonably wrap our heads around. Megalodon existed on a scale that breaks most ordinary comparisons. The largest individuals are estimated to have reached somewhere around 80 feet in length, roughly 24 meters, longer than a school bus, longer than most of the fishing boats that would later go hunting for its fossilized teeth. Estimates place its weight somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 metric tons or more. In the plainest possible terms, a single megalodon likely weighed more than a fully loaded semi-truck, more than a small commercial aircraft, more than a great white shark multiplied over and over again. Its jaws could have swallowed a grown adult whole without the animal even slowing down, and the teeth lining those jaws, the same teeth that still occasionally wash up on beaches and get sold in fossil shops today, could measure more than 7 inches from root to tip. Here's the detail that should really stop you in your tracks. This wasn't a predator that dominated a single region, a single climate, or one conveniently warm patch of ocean. Megalodon teeth have turned up on nearly every continent on the planet, from warm shallow waters near the equator all the way to fossil beds in cold, high-latitude seas, exactly the kind of environment where, by every rule scientists thought they understood about sharks, it should never have been able to survive. For roughly 20 million years, this animal held undisputed, essentially unchallenged control over the world's oceans. Not shared dominance. Not regional supremacy. Total, planet-wide control, the kind of reign no single predator before or since has ever come close to matching. Human empires rise and fall across centuries. Megalodon's empire lasted 20 million years, a span of time so enormous that it's genuinely difficult for the human mind to hold on to. And then, it was gone. That exact combination, the almost incomprehensible size, the global reach, and the sudden total disappearance, is what turned Megalodon into one of the most obsessed-over animals in the entire fossil record. But it also created a real scientific problem, one that researchers spent close to 2 centuries wrestling with, often without fully realizing how much ground they were losing in the process. When an animal disappears 3.5 million years before anyone thinks to seriously study it, and leaves behind almost nothing but its teeth, you're working from the faintest possible whisper of what it actually was. Teeth are remarkable in their own right. They're the single most durable material a body can produce, which is exactly why they survive long after everything else. The skin, the muscle, the cartilage, the eyes, the enormous beating heart, has long since dissolved back into the sediment without a trace. But teeth alone can't tell you how an animal moved, how warm-blooded it ran, what exactly it ate, or where it actually fit inside the vast, layered machinery of an ancient sea. For that kind of detail, ideally, you'd want its DNA. And this is exactly where researchers ran headfirst into a wall that has frustrated everyone who ever dreamed of bringing this animal back into sharp focus. Megalodon's DNA isn't misplaced somewhere, waiting in some undiscovered fossil bed. It's gone, in the most permanent sense that word can carry. Ancient genetic material is extraordinarily delicate. Even under close to ideal conditions, the molecules that carry the instructions for building a body eventually break down and scatter beyond recovery. The realistic outer limit for extracting usable ancient DNA sits somewhere around 1 to 2 million years, an optimistic ceiling achievable only in rare, consistently frozen environments. Megalodon went extinct at least 3.5 million years ago. That isn't a gap you close with a better lab or a more sensitive instrument. The genome of the largest predatory shark that ever lived simply isn't coming back. Not now, not ever. Which is exactly why, for most of the last 2 centuries, the picture we had of Megalodon was less a firm scientific conclusion and more an educated guess dressed up convincingly as one. That guess traces back to a single decision, made by a single naturalist working in Switzerland in 1843, sitting with a handful of fossilized teeth. He examined those enormous serrated blades, then compared them to the teeth of the most famous predator swimming in the oceans of his own era, and drew a connection that felt, at the time, entirely reasonable. Both had large teeth. Both had serrated edges. Both were clearly the terror of whatever waters they moved through. So he filed this ancient giant right alongside its modern lookalike, a decision that would shape how the world pictured Megalodon for nearly 180 years afterward, built on a resemblance every bit as misleading as any in the history of the field. He was working with the best evidence available to him at the time, which amounted to almost nothing beyond the teeth themselves. He genuinely couldn't have known better. The tools that would eventually reveal the truth wouldn't exist for another century and a half. But an idea, once written down by a respected authority and printed into the foundational texts of a field, has a strange tendency to harden into something that feels like settled fact. And this one hardened almost completely. Consider what that single classification actually did. It didn't just sit quietly inside some scientific catalog. It escaped out into the wider world, becoming the default mental image every child, filmmaker, and museum curator reached for when picturing this animal. If Megalodon was essentially a kind of oversized great white, then all you had to do was take that familiar torpedo-shaped, gray-backed hunter everyone already feared and blow it up to monstrous proportions, stretch that silhouette to the length of roughly 3 school buses parked end to end, and give it a mouth you could stand inside. It was simple, vivid, and turned out to be almost entirely wrong, because 2 animals can end up looking remarkably alike for reasons that have nothing to do with actual kinship. In the ocean, being a fast, large, meat-eating predator comes with a fairly narrow menu of workable engineering solutions. Cutting teeth, serrations to saw through flesh and bone, a body built for rapid acceleration. Evolution, working entirely independently on 2 separate family lines, often stumbles onto similar answers to the same problem. Scientists have a specific name for this phenomenon. Convergence, one of the more seductive traps in biology, because it produces animals that look closely related when they're nothing of the sort. For a century and a half, nobody had the tools to see through it. You can't resolve a question of ancestry by staring harder at a tooth. You can measure it, weigh it, study its serrations under a microscope, and you're still only looking at surface detail. The true relationship between 2 species is written in a language teeth alone were never built to speak, the language of lineage and descent across the deep gulf of geological time. Reading that properly would require tracing the branching family tree of sharks themselves, back through the living relatives whose DNA we can actually read, untangling which modern species sit on which branch. That kind of work simply wasn't possible until the genomic revolution finally handed biologists the tools that would quietly dismantle the old great white assumption piece by piece. That revolution effectively gave researchers 2 gifts at once. The first was the ability to reconstruct evolutionary identity directly, sequencing the genomes of living sharks and using their differences and similarities to map exactly how far back their branches split. Megalodon's own DNA was gone, but its living cousins still carried, in their cells, a record of those ancient forks in the road. The second gift was subtler and, in some ways, even more remarkable. The realization that a fossil tooth isn't merely a shape, but a chemical archive. As it forms inside a living animal, it locks away atomic signals recording how warm the animal ran, roughly what it ate, and where it sat in the food chain. Unlike DNA, those signals don't decay. They're baked directly into the mineral structure, stable across millions of years, waiting in every fossil tooth for someone to finally learn how to read them. So the picture began shifting on two fronts at once. On one front, molecular phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relationships through genetic comparison, went to work rebuilding the shark family tree, and the result came as a genuine shock to anyone still holding the old assumption. The great white shark, it turned out, did not descend from anything resembling Megalodon. Its actual ancestry traced back through a lineage of mako sharks, sleek, fast, open-water hunters, passing through an intermediate ancestor that lived in roughly the same seas Megalodon dominated. The great white belonged to an entirely separate family branch. Megalodon descended from its own distinct lineage, stretching back more than 55 million years, through a genus of sharks whose story ran parallel to, but never merged with, the one that eventually produced the great white. When researchers traced both branches back to their last common ancestor, they found it sitting roughly 100 million years before Megalodon itself went extinct. The evolutionary distance between them turned out to be wider than the distance separating plenty of animals nobody would ever confuse with each other. They weren't cousins. They were two entirely separate evolutionary solutions to the same ancient problem, occupying the same waters at the same time, which meant Megalodon was closer to being the great white's rival than its ancestor. That correction alone would have been more than enough to force a rewrite of the textbooks. But it turned out to be only the beginning of what those fossil teeth were still willing to give up. While the family tree was being redrawn, the second gift, the chemistry sealed inside the enamel, was being pried open using a technique that would have sounded like science fiction only a few years earlier. It's called clumped isotope thermometry. When a tooth mineralizes inside a living animal, the atoms assembling into it aren't all identical. Carbon and oxygen both come in slightly heavier and lighter varieties, and the rate at which the heavier versions bond together depends heavily on temperature. The warmer the tissue as the tooth forms, the fewer heavy isotopes end up paired together. The cooler it is, the more of them lock together. That ratio, frozen into the enamel at the moment of formation, becomes a thermometer that never stops working, one capable of reading the exact internal warmth of an animal that died millions of years before the first human ever took a breath. So a team of researchers attempted something that, on paper, sounds almost impossible. They gathered fossilized Megalodon teeth, measured that clumped isotope signature, and effectively asked the enamel a question nobody had ever been able to put to a Megalodon before. How warm were you when you were alive? In a study published in 2023, the answer finally arrived: direct empirical evidence rather than educated guesswork. The enamel recorded an internal body temperature running roughly 7 degrees Celsius above the surrounding seawater. In waters averaging around 27 degrees, this animal carried its own internal furnace. When researchers turned that same technique on other sharks from that era, the genuinely cold-blooded hunters, their teeth told a very different story, tracking closely with the surrounding water, drifting somewhere between 22 and 26 degrees. Megalodon generated its own heat. Sit with what that finding actually means, because it changes how you have to picture this animal moving through the world. A cold-blooded shark is, in a real sense, a prisoner of the water surrounding it. Drop the temperature and its muscles slow, its metabolism drags, its whole biological engine idles towards stillness. That's why, during Megalodon's era, cold water functioned almost like a physical wall. Push past a certain latitude, dive below a certain depth, and the water grew cold enough to shut most predators down completely. But an animal generating its own internal heat carries its own personal climate wherever it goes. Its muscles stay quick, its metabolism stays lit, and it can dive deeper and push into higher latitudes than any cold-blooded rival would dare, chasing prey across thermal boundaries nothing else could follow it over. This is precisely what the fossil record had quietly been showing all along: Megalodon teeth turning up again and again in cold high-latitude waters where, by the old assumptions, a giant shark simply shouldn't have survived. The internal warmth explained the map. And then two separate threads of evidence: the animal's sheer size and its internal warmth, braided together into something even more elegant. In a warm-blooded animal, being enormous isn't just about raw power, it's also about thermal efficiency. Heat escapes across a body's surface, and the larger an animal grows, the smaller that surface becomes relative to its total mass. So a large warm body loses heat far more slowly than a small one. Every additional ton of muscle Megalodon carried made it a more formidable hunter, but it also made maintaining that internal warmth cheaper. Size fed warmth, and warmth rewarded even greater size, each trait reinforcing the other in a spiral that ran uninterrupted for millions of years. The staggering scale of this animal wasn't a coincidence sitting beside its warm-bloodedness. The two traits had grown up together. But the teeth still weren't finished talking. There remained the separate question of exactly what an animal like this actually ate, and precisely where it sat within the towering food chain of its era. For that piece of the puzzle, researchers turned to yet another chemical signal buried inside the enamel, this time involving zinc. Zinc isotopes carry a peculiar and genuinely useful property. The ratio between their heavier and lighter forms shifts in a predictable, measurable way each time you move up a single rung of a food chain. A plant-eating animal carries one particular signature. Whatever eats that plant eater carries a slightly shifted version of it. The predator that eats that animal shifts the signature again. So by carefully reading the zinc locked inside a fossil tooth, scientists can reconstruct not just roughly what an animal ate, but precisely how high it stood above everything else that was eating and being eaten within that same ancient sea. In a study published in 2022, that's exactly what one research team set out to do. They measured zinc signatures across an entire community of ancient sharks and marine animals, effectively building a detailed chemical ladder representing the whole ecosystem, and then placed Megalodon somewhere on that ladder. Megalodon didn't sit near the top of that ladder. It sat squarely at the very top, a full trophic level above even the great whites sharing those waters. It was feeding on large marine mammals, prey with real size and heft, and quite possibly on other formidable predators almost nothing else could threaten, let alone kill. Nothing was hunting Megalodon. Megalodon was hunting the hunters. It occupied a position so elevated that for 20 million years the phrase apex predator barely did it justice. In its own seas, it effectively was the ceiling. For a long, stable stretch of deep time, that ceiling held. The zinc signatures recovered across millions of years told the same steady story again and again. This animal firmly above, everything else consistently below, two apex lineages calmly keeping to their own distinct rungs, feeding on different resources, never truly colliding. But when researchers finally reached the youngest available samples, teeth formed as the extinction event drew near, the numbers began doing something the earlier layers never had. The zinc signatures belonging to the great whites and the zinc signatures belonging to Megalodon, two signals that had stayed cleanly separated across millions of years, suddenly began sliding toward each other. The gap that had defined their entire shared history was visibly closing. In those final samples, the two lines nearly touched. Two apex predators that had spent an entire geological age feeding in different worlds were suddenly, unmistakably, reaching for the exact same food. It's a small, quiet detail buried in a spreadsheet of isotope ratios, but sit with what it actually describes, because it becomes one of the more genuinely haunting fragments of evidence in this entire story. For 20 million years, the ocean had been large enough to support both predators, precisely because it was so clearly layered. Megalodon claimed the largest available prey, meals that its size, warmth, and speed made accessible to essentially nothing else. The great whites, smaller and cooler-blooded, worked one level below. There was no real war between them, because they were never genuinely competing for the same resources. But in that final chapter, the chemistry says the layers themselves collapsed. Either the great whites climbed upward, or the very prey Megalodon depended on thinned out, forcing the giant to reach downward into those same crowded waters, chasing an increasingly shrinking supply. Either way, the outcome is written directly into the enamel. At the very end, the two of them were unmistakably fishing the same shrinking pond. And here is where every thread these fossil teeth had been quietly spinning finally ties together into a single, fairly merciless knot. This was a genuinely warm-blooded animal, and that internal warmth was the engine behind everything else. The reach into cold seas, the raw speed, the deep dives, the full 20-million-year run of dominance. But being warm-blooded isn't an optional advantage you can set aside once conditions turn difficult. A warm-blooded body at that scale is a furnace that never stops burning, demanding fuel constantly, whether prey is abundant or vanishing. A cold-blooded shark can throttle its metabolism down toward almost nothing and comfortably wait out a lean season. Megalodon fundamentally could not. 90+ metric tons of heated, active muscle cannot simply idle. It cannot fast its way through a famine. It has a metabolic floor, and that floor does not come down. Picture the Pliocene Ocean as it genuinely existed during those final millennia. The seas were cooling and reorganizing. Populations of the large marine mammals that a warm-blooded giant needed by the ton were actively contracting, their ranges fragmenting. The buffet that had fed the ceiling of the ocean for 20 million years was steadily thinning out. And at the exact moment that food supply began disappearing, a hungrier, more metabolically efficient, cold-blooded competitor was climbing into that same shrinking feeding zone, an animal able to survive on far less, and able to simply wait things out. The very trait that had built Megalodon's dynasty became precisely the thing that couldn't save it. The warmth that made it unstoppable also made it permanently unable to stop needing enormous amounts of fuel. Its greatest strength and its fatal weakness turned out to be the exact same trait, viewed from two different sides of a changing world. Megalodon didn't fall to some greater monster. It fell to arithmetic, to a metabolic bill it could no longer pay in an ocean that had stopped providing enough. Just as this picture seemed complete, one final study rewrote the last major thing everyone thought they understood: what the animal actually looked like. For nearly 2 centuries, artists drew Megalodon as a great white blown up to nightmare proportions. But in 2025, a team of nearly 30 researchers took a rare set of preserved vertebrae recovered from Belgium and Denmark, compared them against the body proportions of 165 living shark species, and ran the underlying physics. A great white's bulky body shape, scaled up to 80 feet, would have generated so much drag that the animal could barely have moved, fighting the water with every stroke. The only genuinely efficient body plan for a creature that long turned out to be slender, tapered, and streamlined, less like a swollen great white, and considerably more, in its proportions, like a large baleen whale, a long, smooth, gliding hunter built for cruising vast distances through open water. Those same vertebrae held one final secret, read from the internal growth bands layered inside them, much like the rings inside a tree trunk. Megalodon was apparently born already enormous, somewhere between roughly 11 and 13 feet long, likely reaching that size in the womb by consuming its own unfertilized siblings before it was ever born. A newborn Megalodon, on the very first day of its life, would have entered the ocean at roughly the size of a fully grown adult great white, the largest great white you could imagine. That was simply the starting size of a baby Megalodon. And in the strange, almost circular cruelty of deep time, that same great white lineage, born so much smaller by comparison, is the very competitor whose slowly climbing zinc signature ultimately helped push the giant toward extinction. So the DNA really is gone, and it isn't coming back. The roughly 2 million year ceiling on ancient genetic recovery is real, and 3.5 million years remains a wall no foreseeable technology can climb. Scientists will never hold Megalodon's actual genome in their hands. But what the animal left behind, the teeth scattered across every continent, the chemistry sealed inside the enamel, the growth bands, and a handful of preserved vertebrae, turned out to be enough. Enough to strip away 180 years of a comforting but wrong picture. Enough to prove it was genuinely warm-blooded, that it ruled the absolute ceiling of its world, that its own warmth served as both its throne and its executioner, that it was shaped far more like a whale than a shark, and that it was born already close to the size of the very animal whose descendants would eventually help end its reign. The animal never told us its story in words, and it never told us in genes. It told us in stone, in atoms, in patience, and after nearly 2 centuries, we finally learned how to listen.